I feel like we should have a little bit of music playing as people join. We'll give everybody a few minutes to join.
One.
All right, I think it's a few minutes. It's now a minute after 12, so I might as well start with my introduction. So I want to welcome our participants to one of our decision analysis sponsored webinars. It's the end of August. It's also probably a busy time as people are starting new school years. And so we appreciate the participation. And I will go ahead and I guess I'll say I'll introduce myself first. I'm Robin Dillon Merrill. I am a professor at Georgetown University, and I am the current president of the Decision Analysis Society. And I have the honor of introducing our speaker. And I didn't get her to help me practice how to say her last name. So we're going to try that, and she can maybe correct me. But our speaker is Dr. Eeva Vilkkumaa. Is that close?
Very nice. Yes.
Close.
Yeah.
Okay, Vilkkumaa. And she is an assistant professor of management science at the Department of Information and Service Management at Aalto University School of Business in Finland. She received her doctoral degree in 2014 at the Department of Mathematics and Systems Analysis at Aalto University of Science. Her research interests include multi-criteria decision analysis, portfolio decision analysis, scenario methods, strategic foresight, behavioral decision theory, and applications to healthcare and strategy development. She has 18 years of experience in teaching courses on operations research, business analytics, and strategic foresight at Aalto University and Aalto Executive Education and Professional Development. Eeva has published in leading scientific journals such as Management Science, Operations Research, and the European Journal of Operations Research. She is an editorial board member of the Journal of Multi-Criteria Decision Analysis, and she has also been a partner and consultant in 2 companies specializing in the use of mathematical modeling for decision support and strategy development. And so with that, Eeva, I look forward to your talk.
Thank you so much, Robin. I'm so glad to be here. I was browsing through the list of presenters that you had, and I was like, oh, so excellent to be in such a great company. So thanks again for inviting me. But let's go ahead and start with the presentation. So today I will be talking about our recent paper entitled A Framework for Selecting Action Portfolios with Incomplete and Action-Dependent Scenario Probabilities. Now, this framework that we developed is relatively general so that it can be applied in various kinds of contexts in which you would choose a portfolio of actions that consume resources. However, there was a real life case that inspired the development of the framework. And so I will be actually presenting the framework through this case study just to make it a bit more tangible for you. But before I jump into that, I will present my co-authors. So Petri Rikkinen, who is my doctoral student, but he just hasn't been very active lately, so that's why I said was. So he's in the business life actively right now. And then Professor Juuso Liesio, who is also from the Department of Information and Service Management and a longtime colleague. But without further ado, let's jump into the case. So imagine that it's year 2017, and there was actually quite a lot going on at the time in the payments industry, the payments market. So first of all, there was the PSD2 Payment Services Directive number 2 that was ongoing by the European Commission, and the sort of fear of this directive was that it was going to kind of open up the market for various kinds of companies to come into the payments market, and also to open up the payments data to various kinds of parties. And then there was also the fact that customers were kind of getting used to convenient digital payment services such as PayPal and Klarna and those kinds of things. And then there was a lot of talk about cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin, and not in the speculative sense, but rather as legitimate payment methods that would kind of replace existing methods. So we then were working at the time with Nordea Bank, which is the largest retail bank in the Nordic countries. And they, as an established financial institution who had always been kind of covering payments with their trusted partners, such as MasterCard and Visa, they were kind of looking at these turbulent times in the payments market with a bit of a fear in their head. So they really wanted to renew their 10-year strategy to take into account all these uncertainties. So to capture this wide range of uncertainties, they wanted to build scenarios to support them in their strategy process. And they had actually done strategy scenario work before, but they hadn't really linked decision recommendations very explicitly with these scenarios. So they just wanted this time to really have that link between scenarios and decision recommendations very clear. So in our language, they wanted to build this decision model on top of the scenarios. And finally, they didn't want to just prepare for these alternative futures or threats or opportunities. They also wanted to adopt this proactive mindset in that they also, as the largest retail bank in the Nordic countries, they would have some sort of a role possibly to shape the future market environment. So against this background, we came in and we designed and implemented this decision analytic framework. And the purpose was to identify a portfolio of strategic actions such that these actions would be robust across future scenarios. So the actions would perform relatively well, regardless of which of the scenarios would be realized. And then also they would shape the market towards the desirable direction. So technically that means that these actions could possibly increase the probability of the more desirable scenarios and decrease the probability of those scenarios that were not so good. So in a nutshell, the first stage of our framework is the definition of the scenarios. And here you would also have some information about scenario probabilities. Now, when you are looking at sort of 10-year qualitative scenarios, it's really impossible to assign precise probabilities for these scenarios. Even if you would, probably no one would trust any decision recommendations based on precise estimates about scenario probabilities. So what we wanted to do was to allow incomplete scenario probability information. And the next stage, that would be the definition of objectives and attributes and utility, attribute-specific utility functions and attribute weights. And here as well, we knew that we were going to be working with a team of people, and sometimes it's hard to agree on attribute weights, for instance. So we wanted to also keep that in the incomplete information world. So if there were no precise attribute weights, then that would be fine as well. And the third stage would be the creation of action proposals. So you could come up with different kinds of proposals for actions that would perform well in certain scenarios. And then you would also evaluate those action proposals across different scenarios on different attributes. And again, you don't know what the attribute-specific impacts in different scenarios are going to be, so incomplete information is something that you want to have there as well. And then the fourth stage will be the definition of shaping actions. So if there are some actions that could increase or decrease the probabilities of different scenarios, then those are the shaping actions. And then finally, the fifth stage would be to take all this information and plug it into a model and produce decision recommendations. So what are the novel contributions here? Well, there is a new model. So there really has not been a portfolio model that would accommodate all this incomplete information, so about scenario probabilities and attribute weights and the action's impacts, and also have this action dependency for the scenario probabilities. So in this sense, this portfolio model was something quite new. And then also, because there hadn't been this model before, there was also no algorithm for computing the set of non-dominated portfolios or decision recommendations from the model. So we also created this new algorithm for computing this set. And finally, we report in the paper a high impact case. So that's kind of our third contribution for this paper. But let's go across the stages. So the first stage was scenarios. So there are different kinds of methods for developing scenarios, and the framework in itself is kind of doesn't care what method you use, but I'm just gonna show you the method that we used for this. So we first defined here 6 uncertainty factors that were seen to be the most important from the point of view of the future of the payments market at that time. So you had the EU economy, you had competitors, value chain and networks, technology, customer needs, and regulation. And all of these uncertainty factors had 3 to 4 different outcomes. So the economy, for instance, could be either sort of growing in a stable fashion, or you could have a crisis, the Eurozone could break up, or then you could, in a dream world, have this fast growth situation going. And then for competitors, for instance, you would have the nice case for banks, that banks would dominate by innovating new services. And then the other possibility, which they were fearing at the time quite a lot, global players, basically Google, Alipay, Facebook at the time, Amazon or Apple could kind of come in and take over the payments market. And then finally, fragmentation. So you could have these local schemes starting to win the market and so forth. So using this table, what you try to do is kind of find plausible but mutually dissimilar combinations of these uncertainty factor specific outcomes and build scenarios based on these combinations. So for instance, global giant scenario would be such that you would have this stable growth in the economy, the global players would dominate, they would have their open ecosystems, technology would be kind of driven by AI and analytics, and then customers' needs would be mostly about convenience and easiness. And then you would have a kind of also the regulatory environment enabling these big players to come in by opening the payment market. On the other hand, this is kind of the dream scenario, the green one for the banks. So you could have this very fast growth and banks dominate and they have their own negotiated ecosystems. And then there would be some sort of a disruptive technology that would change payments. Probably they could leverage that technology somehow. Customers would really love like a nice brand and security. So that would again be something for the banks to enjoy. And then you would have this over-regulation getting foothold, which is usually on the side of these established companies who are used to working within the tight regulation. So we came up with 5 of these different combinations. They were all kind of plausible combinations. You can read more about the scenario method in this paper that I put here by Teemu Seeve and myself. When we wrote the narratives, though, we just noticed that the yellow and blue scenario narratives were quite similar. So we ended up combining them into a single scenario called Giants and Empires. And basically, the similarities came from both of them having this outcome that the global players would dominate the market, and also that the customers would value something other besides the security, control, and brand. So finally, we had 4 different scenarios, and here are just very brief descriptions of the narratives, so very, very short summaries, and you can then find the longer stories in the paper. But basically, you had the safe network scenario, which was the dream scenario for banks, where everything is as it's always been. Then you had new rules scenario, which was very innovation driven, technology driven. Then you had a fragmentation scenario where the Eurozone was breaking and the market was just fragmented. And then you had the giants and empires scenario where these existing giant corporations would come in and take over the market. So here basically are the four scenarios that we started working with. The next step was to elicit information about scenario probabilities. So as said, it's not advisable to use precise probabilities. There are, in fact, many people who argue that you shouldn't use probabilities with scenarios at all. And I understand that view. However, I've seen it quite many times that if you don't put any explicit information on these probabilities, then people kind of implicitly make probability judgments in their heads anyway. So what we decided to do is use this incomplete, very flexible information. So just rank these scenarios in terms of their probability. So we had giants and empires that was ranked first by the management team. Then we had new rule scenario, the innovation scenario. Then we had fragmentation scenario third, and safe network scenario was last. And this was maybe also an attempt by the management team to not be lured by optimism bias. So they just put it there on the fourth place. And then we also imposed a lower bound of 10% for all of these probabilities. So this resulted in the set of feasible probabilities shown here. So this P zero, so zero just means that we haven't considered the shaping actions yet. So you'll see where this goes later on. So we have basically these linear inequalities for the scenario probabilities, 4 of them, and then we have this lower bound of 10%. And then, of course, all the probabilities need to be within 0 and 1, the interval, and sum up to 1. So just regular probability axioms are satisfied. So what this results in are these kinds of intervals for the scenario probabilities. So giants and empires, for instance, it can have a probability as small as 25% and can go up to 70%. So you can pick values from here such that they respect the ranking and also sum up to 1. So in a sense, some of these intervals are quite wide. Okay, so then we have stage number 2. And this is the definition of objectives and attribute-specific utility functions. Now we decided to move forward with 2 objectives, and there is kind of a legacy story here. In their previous work, they had been only considering revenue, and this, in their opinion, had led to kind of short-sighted decision making. So they wanted to have this sort of a proxy for these longer term objectives, and then we decided to go with customers' needs. And the attribute scales are qualitative, again, because if you're thinking about a 10-year time frame, then it's really impossible to say that this action in that scenario will generate revenue of blah, 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 this and this amount of money. So we wanted to use qualitative scales instead. And then regarding customers' needs, there was a question like, this action in this scenario is aligned with customers' needs. And then you could say strongly disagree, and until strongly agree. And then we elicited attribute-specific utility functions for both of these attributes. Then still in stage 2, we have the attribute weights. So the question was basically to get a ranking between the weights. We asked, like, which attribute would you first change from its worst to its best level? And there was actually a bit of disagreement about this. So we decided to go ahead with these kinds of intervals. So basically assign a lower bound of 40% for each of the attribute weights. And of course, they had to sum up to 1 as well. So that translated into these 40 to 60% intervals for both weights. And then we are ready to move on to stage 3, so the definition of action proposals. And here, first, we had around 200 action proposals, and these were obtained sort of through a kind of value-focused thinking mindset. So what kinds of actions should be taken to reach the objectives in these different scenarios. And the long list was then shortened through like grouping similar actions together, and then also in the workshop setting, having these pitching and exercises and voting and stuff like that. So we ended up with 15 action proposals, and they had these bit goofy names. So sorry about that. So you can't really tell what all of these are, but they are here categorized under these titles like reframing your market definition, changing your business network, influencing social norms, redefining products, securing competing alternatives, secure needed infrastructure, and changing your pricing logic. And maybe I could highlight that, for instance, here, new BFFs, so new best friends forever, that was referring to partnerships with these global giant companies. And next, again, or still in the same workshop, we had an assessment of the action's impacts. So basically, people were working in small groups, and they got these pen and paper templates, and they were to look at one attribute and one scenario at a time. So here, for instance, impact on revenue, and then giants and empire scenario, and they had the list of 15 actions. And then they were to basically assess the impact of doing the action in that scenario with respect to the attribute in question, and then the impact of not doing it as well. And if they were unsure about this impact, then they could tick multiple boxes. So again, we didn't want to force the management team members to give any more precise information that what they were willing to do or felt comfortable with, just to sort of in advance try to make sure that they would then trust the decision recommendations as well. So here they were able to give that incomplete information. And then if you recall the attribute-specific utility functions, we plugged all these crosses through that and ended up with this data table, basically. So here we have, in the upper half, we have the impact on revenue, and lower half is customers' needs. And then we have all the scenarios there as well, and the utilities of doing and not doing the action. And now they have been put through the utility function, so they are on a scale between 0 and 100. And whenever you see an interval, it means that they've been ticking multiple boxes there. So that's the assessment data. Again, yeah, still done in the workshop. Then there was the definition or identification and creation of shaping actions and assessing their impacts. So we asked basically, okay, given these 15 actions that you were just assessing, are there some actions within these 15 that you think would have an impact on the scenario probabilities? And indeed, they felt that there were, so new best friends forever was seen to have an impact such that it would increase the probability of this giant and empire scenario and decrease the probability of the fragmentation and safe network scenarios. So kind of if you're partnering up with these giant corporations, you're sort of inviting them into the market, and maybe that makes it more likely that they will dominate the market as well with their superior AI capabilities. And then on the other hand, if you partner up, then it might not be as likely that the market will fragment or that you will remain the dominant player. And then you have sort of opposite impacts, at least when it comes to giants and empires and safe networks, from actions such as build one's own ecosystem, build a brand of trust, inventing the new world, which is very sort of innovate and come up with new technological solutions type of action. And then we also asked them to think about actions that could have an impact on scenario probabilities, but hadn't been considered before because they didn't have sort of any intrinsic utility in the scenarios. And yes, they came up with this suggestion about lobbying for tighter regulation. So the only purpose of this action is basically to affect the scenario probabilities and not like perform nicely in that scenario if it has already taken place. So that this 16th action was then brought also into the analysis. So the next stage was to turn these arrows or this table into constraints on these scenario probabilities. And this is a bit of an art form. So here we didn't have any sort of systematic framework of how to do this. So maybe the purpose was just to find inequalities that would be kind of compatible with these arrows. So this is definitely a direction for future research, how to make this process a bit more systematic. However, at this point, if we now go into some notation, so we have a portfolio that can be represented by this vector, which has binary elements, such that Zj is equal to 1 if and only if the jth action is included in the portfolio, so otherwise it's 0. So the shaping actions, so here we have actions 1 through 4, as well as action 16. They divide the set of all possible portfolios into here 8 mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive sets, ZK. And each of these portfolio sets corresponds to a different set of feasible scenario probabilities. So the 8 number is just relevant for this case. In some other case, it could be something totally different. But here we felt that these sets were kind of respecting the arrows in the table in the previous slide. So for instance, set Z0 is one that contains portfolios that have none of these shaping actions. So the gray cell in this table basically means that the action is included in the portfolio. So if you don't have any of them, then you're in this set. Also, if you have this A1 action, the new BFFs action, and any combination of the other market shaping actions, then you would basically be in the a priori probability set where you had giants and empires being the most likely, then new rules, fragmentation, safe networks, and then the lower bound of 10%. But then if you just had new BFFs and none of the other shaping actions, then you would actually increase the giants and empires scenario probability, especially through this latter constraint, and then you would decrease the probability of scenarios 3 and 4, which is what the arrow said. So you relax the lower bound of 10% and also have this latter inequality taking care of that, and so forth. So now we have 8 portfolio sets, and then we also have 8 probability sets corresponding to each of these portfolio sets. Excellent. So then we have basically all the information that we need, and we are ready to go to the portfolio model. So this is just an expected utility model, although now we have this causal decision theory flavor to it, since we have the probabilities of different outcomes depending on your choices. But here's the formula. So you are summing over all scenarios here. So n is the index for the scenario, and Pn is the probability of scenario n. And here the argument Z says that this probability can in fact depend on the actions that you have selected. Then you're summing over all the actions indexed by J, and you have here this binary decision variable. So Zj equals 1 if and only if action J is included in the portfolio. And if it is, then you end up with taking this summation term into account. So here you are summing over the attributes, and you have the weight of the ith attribute, and then you have the utility of doing action J in scenario N on attribute I. And if you don't do the action, so if Zj is 0, then this term of course vanishes, and then you end up with this term here. And you have just the same, but now you have the utility of not doing the action in scenario N on attribute I. So this is an additive portfolio utility, expected portfolio utility. And here it was kind of important to keep it additive, just to have the decision makers understand where the decision recommendations come from. We did, after the fact, we did some sensitivity analysis for this form. So if you were to use a multiplicative form, then what would that mean with different kinds of risk preferences? And it did not have a big impact, or it only had some impact if you were highly risk averse. So it worked well for the purposes of this case. So we can't really just find one portfolio that maximizes this function because of the incompleteness of the information. So we had incomplete information on scenario probabilities, we had incomplete information on attribute weights, and we had incomplete information on the actions utilities as well. So there is usually no single preferred portfolio. So instead of just trying to find the maximum expected utility portfolio, we actually look for non-dominated portfolios. So decision recommendations are based on the concept of dominance. And according to like standard definitions, portfolio Z dominates portfolio Z prime if its expected utility is higher than or equal to that of Z prime for all feasible probabilities, attribute weights, and utilities in their feasible sets. And if this expected utility is strictly higher for some combination of these parameters. And then one can argue that you shouldn't choose a dominated portfolio, so you can just focus on the set of non-dominated portfolios among the set of feasible portfolios, and this set is denoted by ZF. So set of non-dominated portfolios are all feasible portfolios for which there does not exist another portfolio that would dominate it. Good. So you usually have like a largest set of non-dominated portfolios. So it might make sense to compute some action-specific recommendations based on that set. And for that purpose, we have the core index. Core index as Cij of action J is the share of non-dominated portfolios that include that given action. So the number of non-dominated portfolios that include the action divided by the total number of non-dominated portfolios. And this is nice because now we can get a traffic light representation, and managers love traffic lights. So this works well. So then you have the core actions with a core index of 1. So they're included in all of the non-dominated portfolios. So regardless of what the specific values of your utilities, weights, or probabilities are, you should still go ahead and do these actions. And then at the other end, you have the exterior actions with a core index of 0. So they're not included in any of the non-dominated portfolios, so you should probably not do them. And then in between, we have the borderline actions that are included in some of the non-dominated portfolios, but not all of them. So how to compute this set of non-dominated portfolios. So as said, we didn't have a ready-made algorithm for this. So we came up with one. And this algorithm is actually based on the fact that if you recall the portfolio sets that were defined by these different shaping actions, then if you have a portfolio that's non-dominated among the entire set of feasible portfolios, then it has to be non-dominated among one of the portfolio sets, so the sets Z, K, basically. So we can use that observation to first compute the sets Z and K of non-dominated portfolios within each set Z, F, K. Now we're just limiting ourselves to feasible portfolios using existing efficient algorithms. So for instance, Liesio and others from 2008 have an efficient algorithm for doing this. This is a problem that you can solve by multi-objective mixed integer linear programming. So that's an efficient way of doing that. And then once you have those portfolio set specific non-dominated portfolios, then there are quite few of them. So it's a smallish number of portfolios that you're operating with. So then you can just do pairwise comparisons across these different portfolio sets and eliminate basically portfolios that are dominated by a portfolio in another portfolio set. So here, for instance, you had this green portfolio in Z1, but then when you compare it with a portfolio in Z0, then actually the Z0 portfolio dominates Z1 portfolio, so you just get rid of that. And you do these pairwise comparisons, and then the portfolios that you end up with who are still standing after all these pairwise comparisons, they are your non-dominated set. So that's the algorithm in a nutshell. So then we have the algorithm, we have all the data, we can just put everything there, and we ended up with 36 non-dominated portfolios. And these actually had 3 core actions. So you had this A6, go local, go global. So it was kind of having this local market and global market kind of both operating side by side. Then you have personalization, which was about clever consent management. So whenever you want to do personalized services, you of course have to be mindful of how people consent to you using basically their personal data. And then swoosh, which was about focusing on developing these very convenient technologies and ways of making payments. So they were the core actions. We had one exterior action, milk the cow, which is exactly what it sounds. So I was happy to see this come out as an exterior action since I am a client of that bank. So that was a nice surprise. And then we have plenty of these borderline actions, and their core indices range between 3% and 86%. So what we decided to do is basically say that, okay, starting from this 42%, because there was like a gap between 11 and 42%. So anything that is equal to or higher than 42%, you should kind of keep those actions in the back of your mind as strategic options, and then kind of see where the future is headed, and then maybe revisit these actions. And we also did this comparative analysis with what's called reactive recommendation. So here on the left-hand side, you have what I just showed you. So that's the same table. On the right-hand side, you have the decision recommendation that you would get if you were to neglect the impact that they saw the shaping actions to have. So if you kind of just ignored that, then what would be recommended? And everything else is kind of pretty similar, except for these new BFFs. So it became a core action in the reactive recommendation. And that makes sense because it was well aligned with customers' needs and had a positive impact on revenue in the 2 most probable scenarios, so giants and empires and new rules. However, it's not a core action in the shaping recommendation because it increased the probability of this giants and empire scenario, which was not preferred by a bank, and decreased the probability of the preferred safe network scenario. So it does have a high core index, so it's included in 86% of the recommended portfolios, but it's not 100%. So then this generated kind of important, interesting discussions about how they should pursue with these collaborations. At the time, they were actually then moved forward with Apple Pay, so having Apple as their partner in payments. But there are, of course, other kinds of partnerships that can be carried out as well. And what happened after this? We had one more workshop, and here we kind of did our best to make sure that these decision recommendations then would be implemented. So we had a workshop with the management team. So with them, we produced a roadmap that gave kind of concrete steps about how to move forward with the actions. We also discussed the capabilities. Were they there? Should something be developed so that these actions could actually be implemented? And then, of course, you always have to assign a responsible person to the task, or otherwise it's not going to happen. And then 2 years after the intervention, we went back once more to ask them how they felt about the intervention and what had kind of happened afterwards. And one of the management team's members said that, yes, the intervention had led to actions. So most of the recommended actions were taken further, and they were kind of still thinking about this question about whether to, like, how much to collaborate with the giants and how much to focus on your building your own ecosystem. So that was still an important question. So one impact was at the action level, but then you kind of also had the information that had been generated by the intervention. So this is one of the management team members who was also like a project core team member, so working very actively with us in building this model. And this person said that it was super interesting to focus on multiple, very different kinds of futures at a time, like simultaneously, because in earlier scenario work, they had done the scenarios, but then kind of chosen the most likely future and focused on that in their strategy process. So having these different narratives and kind of keeping them as information for decision making, that was interesting to this person. And then another person said that the results kind of had two life cycles. So directly after the intervention, but then also some years later, you could always go back to the narratives and also the scenario-specific decision recommendations. So if you saw that, okay, this scenario now seems to become more and more likely, are we then doing what we're supposed to be doing? Because we had this like major process where we thought about what we should be doing, then how should we, or are we actually doing what we should? And then finally, there was discussion about behavioral change as well. So they said that when you do this facilitated modeling type of effort, then it really changes your mental models as well. So not just the action recommendations that come out of it, but they also appreciated kind of the changes in mindset and thinking that came from this project. And then one person also said that that they got used to having these sort of strategic level discussions instead of going about with details. So that this person felt that it was kind of the biggest benefit from this whole intervention. So at this point, to conclude, so we have built this general framework for selecting action portfolios when, first of all, the action's impacts depend on which future scenario is realized, and when actions may have an impact on scenario probabilities, and when all this information is incomplete. And this paper has been recently accepted to be published in Management Science, and when it comes out, it'll also have a supplementary material, well-commented code, MATLAB implementation, that has a Nordia case in it, but you can easily kind of tailor it for your own application. So I'm hoping that this will generate interest in applying this method as widely as possible. Of course, questions remain. So now using probabilities, as we have done, that kind of necessitates you kind of assuming that these scenarios are mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. Now, of course, they're not collectively exhaustive, so of course something else can happen, but I think that's always in modeling that you kind of have to understand that now we are focusing only on things that are within the scope of the model and we're leaving everything else out. So it's the same with objectives, that you're kind of only looking at the objectives that you're looking at. But it is important to make sure that you don't have these huge blind spots, because it's the same again as with multi-criteria decision making, that you can suffer from omission bias where you don't have all the relevant objectives and then you don't have good decision recommendations. So it's same here. If you don't have all the relevant scenarios, then you have poor decision recommendations. The mutual exclusiveness is also an interesting question, and that's what we're working on right now, like how to elicit information about this possible overlap and how that can be accommodated in decision recommendations as well. And I already mentioned we need a systematic approach to converting these verbal statements about the action's impacts into portfolio probability sets. And then this is more like an application thing, that to see how this would work when supporting ongoing decision processes instead of these one-off interventions. But that is everything from my side. So if you have any questions or comments, I would be happy to respond.
Thank you, Eva. So I think we have at least one question about the impact of it, but I think I'm going to actually ask my question first because mine is a broader question, I think, about your process. And when I think about portfolios, I think about the kind of classic knapsack problem where you're constrained by the knapsack and you can only put certain items in there. And what was your constraint? Why wouldn't they do all 16 of the items? Like why, except for the one that turned out to be a bad idea? Like what is
Yeah,
really the harm or the constraint? Like why wouldn't you just do all of the things that you could do?
it's a great question. It's mostly about resources. What we actually did, I have this backup slide. So we actually computed the decision recommendations for all portfolio sizes. But usually the problem is that you say that kind of everything is important, everything needs to be done, and then nothing gets done. So they really wanted to have some sort of a, like, what should we focus on right now? And this was the payments unit, so it wasn't like the highest level of the corporation. So when you get the recommendations, you have to kind of sell them up in the organization. So that's where the resource constraint becomes kind of binding. But as you see, in fact, if you would be able to do everything, then you would do everything. So here, when the portfolio size is 16, then actually the core index is 1 for all projects except for the lobby for the tight regulation, because it doesn't have any sort of intrinsic value. So you can either do it or not. So the core index there is 0.5.
I think also on top of it, I really enjoyed your visualizations. You've created some really nice visualizations that really, I think, further explain portfolio analysis and such. And we do have a question from an attendee. Tom Keelan is out there, and his question doesn't surprise me that he would ask this. He wants to know about being able to quantify the degree of impact on the client or industry. So you had some nice quotes where they said, yeah, this is good. We really liked it. It was helpful and things. Do you have any way of demonstrating how it could actually have helped or been helpful to them?
They have their like words from it. So we did get, like, for the purposes of publication, we did get like a verification letter where they were very nice with their comments. But the quantification, that's tough because you don't have the counterfactual. So kind of you don't know what would have happened without the intervention. So to kind of quantify that, you would probably need to have sort of multiple these kinds of interventions, and then some sort of a control group where you don't have these kinds of interventions being carried out. So that would definitely be an interesting question. And I think that's something that we as a group always struggle with, like how to really demonstrate, especially if you have these big interventions, like how to demonstrate their impact, and it's tough.
Saeed, are you going to weigh in here?
Yes, yeah. Thank you, Robin. Thanks a lot, Eva, for the very nice presentation. I really enjoyed it. First of all, I think this is a very general framework, and I can imagine other contexts in which this can be applied. And I think that the beauty of it is obviously is first of all taking into account and integrating the opinion of different members, and at the same time taking into account the link between the objective, the probabilities, and action, and so on. So my question is, I was wondering, after you provided your recommendation, was there anything that came as a like a counterintuitive advice or as unexpected to the management team, saying like, meaning that, look, given that you take into account these connections, like you recommended us, for example, to prioritize action X over Y, but just intuitively we thought Y is better than X or Y is more important than X, but essentially the importance of action X came out as a result of your analysis and as a result of this kind of a, taking into account all these elements of your framework. I think that's to me that's actually very, very interesting if such a thing has happened.
Yeah, it did not happen. So I think it kind of gave them confidence about going forward the way they might have sort of thought intuitively. And I agree that it's sort of, it would be great to have also these surprises, but I think it might somehow, I'm worried that it might kind of create mistrust in the model.
It
So
get pushback.
yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. So sometimes also, well, as you know, these are kind of because we're not kind of modeling a real system, so we're just kind of structuring discussion about beliefs and views. Then these models are also used to kind of gain confidence about what you think anyway, and also to kind of promote your thoughts to someone else because they have been through this structured process. So I think the kind of biggest thing here was to maybe get rid of certain power dynamics. So doing it in this way sort of makes it equal, so everybody can contribute. They actually said in the interviews that was nice, that everybody was able to contribute, and also maybe mitigate some biases, because when we started this process, many people were like, of course we're going to have this safe network scenario, so of course everything's going to be great. So in that sense, maybe it's not the output that was surprising, but there was just a switch in mental models during the project, which made the output not that surprising.
Makes sense. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
I think I'll ask another question, if I can. And so certainly, my interest is around risk, and so I was really interested in how you were coming up with these scenarios with your various different uncertainties and such. And I also know how long it takes to publish work. So since you've completed this, has any of these uncertainties been resolved in a way that provided light or differences in how you constructed your scenarios? So did we get more information as time has gone on that really resonated with how you defined any of the scenarios?
I just randomly saw one of these people here, and I sent who was in this intervention. I sent him the paper. He doesn't work for Nordea anymore, but he works for MasterCard. And then he was like, these things are still relevant. Like even after 8 years has passed, they're still relevant. Well, what has happened, maybe the fragmentation scenario has become like not likely to happen, especially within the next 2 years, which is when the time horizon ends. But we're kind of still somewhere leaning towards the giants and empires scenario, but kind of somewhere in between the safe networks and giants and empires scenario, and then also the new rule scenario, because of AI and everything is coming more stronger and stronger all the time. So in the sense, the 3 other scenarios are all kind of still coexisting. So that's what makes them still kind of relevant for decision making, even today.
Well, thank you. We can pause for a minute. Saeed, do you have another question, or we can give our audience members another minute if they want to add any other questions?
Sure. I think I had the question that you actually asked. I was wondering about what has happened since then and whether there has been any update on the probabilities, but I think Eeva answered that. So yeah.
All right, then I think with that, I think Saeed and I would both like to thank Eeva for having this great webinar. We have recorded it, so we are going to have it available to more folks going forward. And I think it is, and your paper is going to be coming out so people can see the paper. But I think your visualizations are fabulous, and I think this is a great piece of work. I'm really glad you were able to share it.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Eeva.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye. Have a good evening.
You too.
Thank you.